The Basement Tenant, a novel, written by L.Z. Sinclaire, narrated by L.Z. Sinclaire. Chapter 3, Night Shift. Carrie started a list. She didn't mean to. She was a journalist, or she had been, before the divorce turned her professional instincts into evidence of instability, and journalists made lists the way other people made small talk, compulsively, reflexively, because the act of writing something down was the first step toward making it real. The list lived in the Notes app on her phone, under a folder she'd titled House, which was plausible enough if anyone ever looked. Monday, side door opens 12:14 a.m. Footsteps down, silence. Tuesday, side door 11:52 p.m. Footsteps, water running, silence by 12:30. Wednesday, nothing heard. Either he didn't come home or she slept through it. Thursday, side door 1:07 a.m. Footsteps, a pause, long enough that she held her breath in sympathy, then the bed frame. Silence. Friday, 3:22 a.m. Later than usual. She was awake because the Ambien hadn't worked, which happens sometimes, and she'd been lying in the dark composing emails to Derek that she would never send and arguments with Vanessa Aldridge that she would never win. She heard the side door, his footsteps on the stairs, and then, faintly, so faintly she pressed her pillow against the headboard to hear better, the sound of him talking. Low, conversational, not a phone call. There were no pauses for a response, no modulation of the kind you make when you're performing for a device held to your ear. This was someone speaking to another person in the same room. And then the other person spoke back. A woman's voice, lower than Carrie expected, not young. There was a gravity in it, a weight, like a voice that had been used for decades and settled into its lowest register the way old houses settle into their foundations. It spoke for perhaps 10 seconds. Carrie couldn't make out words, just the fact of it, a female presence, a second human being in the basement of her home at 3 a.m. She pulled the pillow away from the headboard, stared at the ceiling. The voices stopped, or she lost them under the hiss of the radiator. She didn't sleep. In the morning, she Googled him. She felt guilty about it for exactly as long as it took the search results to load, which was about 2 seconds. Then the journalist took over, and guilt became irrelevant. Elias Corbin, M.D., Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Internal Medicine, PGY 3. His profile existed on the hospital's resident directory, a small photo, slightly blurred, the kind of institutional headshot taken in bad lighting against a blue backdrop. It was him, or it looked enough like him, the bone structure, the close-cropped hair. But the image quality was poor enough that it could have been a different man with similar features, and Carrie couldn't tell if she was being rigorous or paranoid. She searched deeper. No social media, no LinkedIn, no Instagram, no Twitter, no digital footprint beyond the hospital profile and a listing on a physician directory that gave his medical school, University of Illinois, and his specialty. For a 29-year-old in 2024, this was unusual. Everyone had a digital shadow. Elias Corbin's was either meticulously absent or had never existed in the first place. She closed the laptop, made coffee. stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the gangway that ran alongside the brownstone, the narrow passage between her building and the next, where the side door to the basement unit opened onto a set of concrete steps leading down. From this angle, she could see the top of the door. It was closed, no footprints in the thin skin of snow that had fallen overnight. He was down there, sleeping like he said he would be. She poured the coffee and didn't drink it. That night, she heard the voice again. She was in the kitchen at 11 p.m., which was early for the sounds, but late for her. She'd been grading herself against an invisible standard of normalcy since the divorce, measuring her bedtime, her screen time, her wine intake against the schedule of a woman who had her life together, because she knew in the bone-deep way that comes from having your sanity questioned in a legal filing that everything she did was potential evidence. She was rinsing a glass when she heard it. Not from the basement door, from the floor itself. Sound traveling up through the old joists, through a century of wood and plaster and the compressed history of everyone who'd ever lived in this house. A woman's voice, low and steady, conversational in tone, not distressed, not whispering, just talking, as if continuing a conversation that had been going on for much longer than Carrie had been listening. She set the glass down carefully, turned off the faucet, stood very still. The voice continued. It had a cadence, almost musical, with a kind of tonal inflection that suggested a language Carrie couldn't identify, or English spoken in an accent she couldn't place from this distance through these layers of old construction. Then Elias's voice, joining, lower, quieter than the woman's, a response, an exchange. Carrie moved to the basement door. It was closed, as it always was. She'd put a small hook-and-eye latch on the kitchen side after Elias moved in, more for the symbolic boundary than any real security. She stood in front of it, her bare feet on the cold hardwood, and pressed her ear to the wood. The voices were clearer here, still not intelligible, but textured. She could hear the rhythm of turn-taking, the way one voice would rise slightly at the end of a phrase and the other would respond. It was an intimate sound. Not the intimacy of lovers, but the intimacy of familiarity. Two people who had been talking for a long time, who didn't need to perform for each other. Then the woman's voice stopped, mid-sentence, not trailing off, stopping, the way you stop when you hear something, the way you stop when you know you're being listened to. Silence. And then footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the far side of the basement, from the bedroom area, toward the door where Carrie stood with her ear pressed against it, in her pajamas, at 11 o'clock at night, looking like every accusation Derek had ever made about her. The footsteps reached the other side of the door, stopped. She could feel him there. The door was 2 inches of old oak, and on the other side of it was a man she'd known for 8 days, standing in the dark, and the silence between them was so absolute she could hear her own pulse in her ears. She ran. Up the stairs, 2nd floor, 3rd floor, her bedroom. She closed the door, locked it, sat on the edge of the bed with her hands on her knees and breathed the way her therapist had taught her. 4 counts in, 7 counts hold, 8 counts out, and told herself she was being ridiculous. She was a 37-year-old woman in her own home. She had a tenant. Tenants had guests. Tenants had lives. The lease didn't prohibit overnight visitors. She was hearing conversations through a floor and interpreting them through the distortion of anxiety medication and insomnia and the specific loneliness of a woman whose house was too big and whose life had become too small. She was being ridiculous. She almost believed it.
The end. You have been listening to The Basement Tenant, written by L.V. Sinclaire, narrated by L.V. Sinclaire. Thank you for listening.